Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. On behalf of IslamiCity, Dr. Aslam and I welcome you to the Muharram program, Muharram Time to Remember the World's Oppressed People. There are few individuals in history who have left a legacy of fighting oppression who have become synonymous with virtues such as justice, peace, freedom. People such as Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Rosa Parks, amongst others, have become famous because of their determination to reform society. A towering figure amongst them is Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him. You know, people from various ideologies, various cultures, faith bases honor Imam Hussein because he stood for the rights of all humanity. And he sacrificed his life so that others may live freely, similar to a candle that burns itself out so that others may see darkness. Imam Hussein was unwilling to succumb to oppression, and his integrity told him that he would abide by the dictum, which he said himself, that death with dignity is better than life with humility. So it's in remembrance of Imam Hussein's legacy that this Muharram, we have invited representatives of some of the oppressed minorities to share their story. Firstly, to educate our viewers, and secondly, to explore ways to help address the oppression faced by these marginalized communities. So we began the series Defining Oppression, and then went on to look at the Dalits in India, presented by Dr. Mike Gauss. And then we went on to the persecution of the Native Americans, which was presented by Professor Milo Ristosta. Again, the theme was the same. What can we do? And we wanted to hear from the representatives of these oppressed minorities as to what they were going through. Imam Fatin Saifullah talked about the enslavement of Africans here in the United States. And we had Rabbi Alan Meller and Rabbi Chaim Belek, who talked about the destruction of the temple in 586 BCE and 72 CE and other historical calamities and what they teach us. Of course, the Palestinian tragedy, the Nakba, was discussed, presented by Hidayat Tarifi. And we also had Imam Sadaul Khan, who talked about apartheid in South Africa, a heroic legacy of principal struggles against racism. We were overwhelmed by the presentation by the Uyghurs of China, by Erkin Siddiq, and it was really a culmination of all the other stories that we'd heard to say that this can happen to millions of people in this day and age while the world watches on. The genocide of the Rohingyas in Myanmar and Muslims of India was presented by Dr. Ahmadullah Siddiqui. And today, it is fitting that we conclude this series on the day of Ashura, the day when Imam Hussein was martyred. So today, our discussion will focus now, having heard all these different representatives of these minorities who have been oppressed. How should we, as Muslims, lead the movement to restore dignity to these oppressed nations? And that is a subject. And before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to invite my co-host, Dr. Aslam Abdullah, resident Imam at the IslamiCity, to give us a brief outline, and then we'll invite our guest speaker to observe on the discussion today. Dr. Aslam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walji. Even though every human life is sacred, and the loss of one is the loss of all. But while the series was going on for the last 9 days, I was trying to calculate the casualties, the Dalits, the American Indians, the South Africans, the Africans, the Uyghurs, the Jews, the people from Rohingya and from India, and the Palestinians have gone and have offered in the last 200 years, the number were staggering. The conservative figures tell us that approximately 120 million people suffered death, persecution through this oppression that the power that be imposed upon them. And it happened in front of those people who claim that Christ gives the message of peace, that the Prophet Muhammad stood for justice, that Imam Hussein sacrificed his life for the oppressed people, that Moses took the people out of Egypt. And it happens in front of those people who believe in the United Nations Charter of Dignity for all and respect for all. And the question that comes in our mind is that why did we let it happen? Why did we let it happen? Why did we let 120 million people, regardless of their faith, perish in these oppressive circumstances? And certainly the answers have to come from us, from our generation. And the question that we need to ask, what can we do to prevent these massacres and these genocides in our times with all the might that we have? We are starting a very humble effort on part of those who believe and understand the message of Imam Hussein, that life is important, but sometimes the goal of life becomes more important than the life itself. And it is in this context we hope that both Shias and Sunnis would relive the legacy of Imam Hussein. Rather than pointing fingers at each other, they would come together in defense of innocent people, in defense of the oppressed people, and in defense of those people who have been marginalized, who have been rendered voiceless, who are victims of violence, and who have been dehumanized. With that, I think I give it back to you, and then we will hear a lot from our speaker, who has a tremendous understanding of the issues that we have been discussing for the last 9 days.
Thank you, Dr. Aslam. As I introduce Dr. Abbas, last night when we were talking to Professor Siddiqui, he pointed out 3 things: the kings, the clergy, and the masses who are less educated. And these are some of the issues where we are unable to perhaps sometimes take action or stand up. And perhaps this may be a cue for our speaker also to look at what is it that we can do in terms of ensuring that, in particular, the Muslim community is well informed so that they're able to take some specific measures. But we'll leave that for our speaker to perhaps address the subject, which is how should Muslims lead the movement to restore the dignity of the oppressed nations. Well, I'm delighted that we have Dr. Hassan Abbas again, who joins us today. He is a distinguished professor of international relations at the Nearest South Asia Strategic Studies Center, NESA, and the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He has a very long resume, which is also on our website. I would refer you to that. Suffice it to say that he also serves as a senior advisor at the Project on Shiism and Global Affairs at Harvard. And his current research work focuses on building narratives for countering political, religious extremism and rule of law reforms in developing states. And we believe that Dr. Abbas is the right person to address some of the issues that have been raised in terms of the marginalization and the oppression of some of these communities around the world. Dr. Abbas also regularly appears as an analyst on international media and writes pieces for various international newspapers and academic publications. His latest book, The Prophet's Heir, The Life of Ali ibn Abi Talib, has been published by Yale University. It has been one of the best-selling books which provides a portrait of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib. Dr. Abbas will speak for about 20 minutes, followed by a conversation with Dr. Aslam and I. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Dr. Abbas.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan Walji, for this opportunity, and to my other colleagues here as well. These are extremely important topics that were already discussed in this series, and I'm honored that I'm asked for my humble contribution. I would like to frame these issues in two ways. First and foremost, in terms of 5 major ideas that I think will be useful for the Muslim community in terms of emphasizing the right aspects which needs to be focused on. But before I go into that realm, I would like to first mention the 5, if I may call that, realities also, that first have to be accepted, acknowledged, and understood before we even delve into the area of where there can be a Muslim contribution when it comes to these big ideas and big global role as a leader, in terms of as a voice for the voiceless, as a voice for humanity, as a voice for justice. So the first 5 things that come to my mind, they may sound a bit harsh, but those are the realities in the world today for anyone who would like to make a contribution in terms of their religious community, their political community, or even as a state actor or a non-state actor. The first 5 things to grasp are, number one, in the modern day global politics, there is no such thing as shortcuts. It is not possible for any community or even for any idea to be pitched at a global level and to be pursued as an ideal or as an agenda, thinking that it can receive global attention or even regional or national level attention. So there have to be institutional setups. There has to be an institutional approach behind it. Even if there is money, even if there is awareness, these things, these big ideas require solid research, solid institutional support, and a human resource base which can push it forward. So the first idea is there are no shortcuts. You need institutional approach, you need a resource, and then you need to have the kind of global network which can pitch and push an idea. First, that is part number one. Secondly, for that idea to even work in the medium term or long term, one has to be whether that's a community like we are currently considering for the Muslim community, how they can lead. The Muslim community or the Muslim organization in this movement has to be already a part of the global narrative, because no group, irrespective of their religious or political background, can just come up and pick a topic of their own choice, which may sound very attractive and very powerful for themselves, but they have no history of taking up global causes before. So as good as an idea it may sound, the very first idea, if for any reason it is seen by everyone else as self-serving, then it will have a limited approach and limited scope. I know these are broad ideas, but I want to set the stage by seeing how the land lays, where the wind is flowing, and only then we can fall into that situation. So no shortcuts. Secondly, one has to be a part of a global narrative in terms of various contribution, in terms of credibility. The Muslim community has to look at itself first to see whether they have the global credibility for good reasons or bad reasons. There may be a lack of credibility for all the wrong reasons. They may be biased against you. But that has to be recognized. That's my major point. One has to build that credibility to be part of a global narrative, whether it is environmental issues or it is global politics, or in this case, making a case for those communities worldwide who, as I had said, are voiceless. My third point, the third major point is there is a certain geopolitical power play that is happening in the world. Irrespective of good ideas, there are a few things which are attracting the global attention and global money. For instance, at this moment, the whole issue of the Russia-Ukraine war. What I mean by that is, whether if for any good idea that you have, and you may want to go to the New York Times or to the Wall Street Journal or to the Guardian in England or to CNN or any global network, even Al Jazeera, you are competing against huge interest in the Ukraine-Russia war at one level. In certain areas, there's already a lot of interest and focus in the Arab media, for example, on the Arab-Israel issue. There it is easy to, if there's a regional approach, if we are looking at only Arab media, you may find a way to place your narrative inside that narrative. However, because we are talking about a global movement and a genuine global effort to make a contribution, you'll have to recognize the global power politics. And the China versus United States, howsoever we look at it, unless your narrative fits into this global narrative of what it means to be what we call in our side of the things, global power competition. If we are not able to frame our context in Ukraine-Russia war or US, China, Russia, the global competition, or for example, on the environmental issues, which are taking a lot of attention globally from various groups which are more aware about the environmental issues. Again, these are just examples. What my third major point is, there's a geopolitical global power play that is happening. And our narrative, a Muslim narrative in support of any major big cause, cannot be exclusive, cannot be isolated, cannot be de-linked from those things. Number four, there has to be a recognition that at the if I may call that, at the highest level, or maybe rather than the highest level, I would prefer to actually use at the most effective and influential level globally, is the role of academia and the policy think tanks. That also is an extremely important arena on many major issues. If there's not enough research being produced in those areas, if there's not enough books being published by the world's trade publishers or by the major academic publishing houses, and if there are not many reports coming out on the issues of from a think tanks on any issues, as an example, the Uyghur issue, extremely important issue, what has been happening in China, but there's at times a global north-south division as well on Russia or Ukraine issues as well. In some of the Western countries, there's a certain viewpoint. On the other side, people will give you other examples of whether some of the Western interventions that had taken place in Afghanistan or Iraq, there was one way to look at those issues, and now that Russia is in Ukraine, it is seen from another light. That's from the south. There might be an argument there. My larger point at this time is, for any idea to be effective at a global level, it will have to be also coming out of the global academic centers, whether in the West or maybe in the East. But the global the academic community, because that's the way many countries and major big players will see where the real research is coming from, where your major idea of a movement is substantiated by and supported by field research or not. That's the four major area. And the fifth one is the global media power play. They're global media centers which have far more power and influence than maybe they really deserve. the way they can influence politics. Look at, for instance, the debate within US. I mean, we are Americans. Let's go a bit deep into that just for the purpose of my explaining this point. If you watch for 1 hour, the last 1 hour, whether you watch CNN or Fox News, these are two different worlds. The way what had happened in terms of FBI intervention here, the former US President Trump's house, it is the way it is being depicted. If you are a Fox watcher, it is an entirely different worldview. Whereas if you are a part of the other mainstream media outlet on the East Coast and even the West Coast, the perspective is different. The reason I'm making this case is same as at the global level. If you are watching Al Arabia or you are watching some of the other news outlets in the Arab world, which was, for instance, UAE. Another example, which is actually very useful, is this very, very interesting case of American Muslim activist who has been picked up in UAE. And there's a debate on why was that the case. He was taking up very important cases, Asim Ghafoor, if I correctly remember his name. The way it is being projected and dealt with has to do a lot with how media portrays it and how media will give the focus and background or not. Thank you for your patience and giving me, I mean, these initial 10 minutes or so I took in just setting the frame. Our global idea, which you have presented, is an extremely powerful one and absolutely something which is very much needed. But it will have to cater to these 5 concentric circles that I mentioned. If your ideas, irrespective of their humanity, irrespective of their brilliance, are not fitting into these 5 concentric circles, if you are not engaging with these 5 ideas, this idea, as good as it is not going to be really able to get the global attention. That's my framework that I would recommend. Now I come to what is my recommendation to way to push this, and I think that has already been done in an amazing fashion by the speakers. But if I had to frame it, I would argue the emphasis first and foremost for the Muslims internally to be able to lead this movement. The first it has to be framed in terms of the idea of justice, which is so ingrained in the Muslim intellectual history. Islam is nothing but the ideas of wrapped around the idea of justice and equity. So that's how the Muslim narrative should be looked at, and we can't be selective. And that's the big issue when I'm saying justice. We cannot pick 2 topics and say we want justice on point X and on geopolitical location Y we are looking for justice, but on situation Z in Afghanistan, Iraq, I'm just giving examples, Syria, elsewhere, we look the other way. And there, because justice doesn't suit us in those areas, that we are not looking at it. I'm linking to the idea of credibility. So our credibility as a Muslim nation, as a responsible community taking up the causes, it has to not to be selective in a sense. It has to be seen as solidly an idea of justice. That's number 1. Number 2, which is linked to the idea of justice, or perhaps I should have linked these 2 together, the idea of justice and equality within the Muslims and in all the issues we are dealing with. Let me give just one example of if there are, we are talking about certain minority communities, whether Muslim or not, we are taking up their cause. And at the same time, in 3 countries in Gulf, for example, if we know of human rights violations, and we are ignoring that, people are going to absolutely question us on those issues from their point of view, to try to delegitimize your narrative by saying, look, this is a group which is making an excellent case, but when it comes to the issues of the labor rights in country Y in the Gulf, they look the other way because a lot of money is involved and they can't afford to go against that issue. So the idea of justice and equality in that sense is very much linked. So that can count as one big idea. Second is education and awareness. As I said, there are no shortcuts in these big policy matters. Is the community has educated itself to a point that it has the relevant expertise know-how, awareness, knowledge, influence, that all comes with the education. How much is the influence? I am a big fan of Zaytuna College in California area. I think that's one of the most phenomenal things that have happened in the United States. We can ask sometime the amazing, brilliant leaders of this Zaytuna Muslim College and University, how much funding they have. Are they okay with it? I doubt we'll get a good answer. I think they are struggling in some ways to, or they can do much better with more funding and more resources. So a community which cannot even have can support one of the first Muslim colleges, which is very balanced, very deep in knowledge. If that cannot be done, or let me give another example, which actually is more might be severe. Can anyone, you means my audience, can anyone point me to one major hospital in the United States that's fully funded by the Muslim community in the United States or in Europe? There's one outstanding international level medical school or medical hospital that is catering to the needs of humanity. Is there shortage of money in the, among the Muslim philanthropists? No. Why? And on these issues, and then at times the tendencies to compare us with some of the other communities smaller than us, more resourceful, and you can start looking, just Google the names of the hospitals and you'll find what I'm referring to. Many communities which may be seen linked with some of the problematic political issues as well, but when it comes to their humanitarian support, which builds credibility among the ordinary people, they have spent not billions, maybe trillions of dollars. So my point is education and investment in education and in humanitarian causes. Last but not the least is two other ideas. One is the idea of sectarian harmony, and that is extremely powerful. It's a shame, and it is such a huge disappointment that on some issues within the Muslim communities, they at times look at a cause and first they see, I'm Shia, whether this argument suits my argument on Syria or on X country or not. Whether if I'm Sunni, I'll first see, oh, this is related to maybe Iraq or Iranians or Azerbaijan, or where the Shia majority is. This seemed like a divisive issue. Whether if I'll pursue this, whether I lose my support base in my own constituency, there can't be anything more un-Islamic than this. And unfortunately, let me say that both the communities, the Shia and Sunni, and I'm talking broadly, there are many other smaller Muslim communities as important and as legitimate and as influential, but I'm hitting at the biggest two communities. Their self-serving attitude, looking at this from their colored lens, has been so devastating for the Muslim narrative. And I'm taking this liberty because I know the people who are behind this series are very open-minded, progressive, and you want, and this is considered as a criticism from inside. The sectarian narratives, unfortunately, are entrenched and influencing our global outlook. I have heard this. Let me be totally candidly very candid on this. I've heard from someone, for example, there was an issue on the Palestine cause, and somebody said, oh, why such and such people are talking about it? Why should we talk about it? It doesn't matter to Shias. Are there any Shias in Palestine? For God's sake. Or somebody else saying exactly in the other sense, if something is happening in a Shia majority area and the Sunnis are saying, oh, these are all Shias. And this is not an extreme or exclusive point that I'm making. This is unfortunately the mainstream narratives. These are not talked about. These are very serious issues. Going and reforming these ideas on the sectarian issues is extremely important. I know I have probably 3 to 4 minutes left. I'll move on to the degeneration of the religious thought, which is also linked partly to sectarian ideals, but even more deeper. How many publications are being produced? There is a world of publications that are happening in specialized communities among the Muslims. Only they are reading it, only they know which bookstores to go to, only they are the recipients. The Muslim religious narrative, which were extremely powerful, from Ibn Arabi to Al-Ghazali to so many of the others, the richness of the Muslim mystical dimension, the richness of the Muslim scholarship when it comes to the idea of justice, from so many scholars from all sides, is now missing from the global narratives. Many things you're finding globally they were Muslim scholars historically whose contributions were so solid and powerful, but they are completely entirely missing, to a point where when even your idea of movement, when this will be presented to an ordinary American, even in what we call as the in the Midwest, you'll find them utterly surprised that, oh, there were some Muslim scholars and publications also. So what I'm saying is, there's that degeneration of religious thought. The newer Muslim institutions are not producing the scholarship, or if they are producing great scholarship, they have no weight they are projecting. So how to go about it with those 5 ideas that I mentioned, which are the global concentric circles, that the narratives have to be linked to that, and the other 4 areas where their Muslims are really lacking. What should be our strategy? And that I'll hardly need a couple of minutes to mention that. Number 1, I highly appreciate this framing and this question, because so often even Muslims look at state responsibilities and thinking that there'll be some state X, Y, or Z who will either fund it, or even our own state. We expect that as Americans or as Britishers or as Europeans, we'll talk to our own state and we'll change their policy. No. Some of the most phenomenal and fundamental changes in modern politics have happened from non-state institutions. The NGOs, or like the initiative that you're mentioning, emphasize on this. Don't ever look for any state to take up your policy. The idea, the power of the idea and the community behind it, and its relevance and its outreach to different influential communities is going to be the difference. State as such has lost the credibility everywhere. When states take up ideas, people are more skeptical. So the non-state approach that you're looking at is extremely important, and build with that. Secondly, persistence will matter. It is going to be any strategy that you will think of for the dignity, or bringing back the dignity of humanity. It will have to be a long-term commitment in terms of persistence. Third, learning from Imam Hussain alayhi salam. Whether are we ready to take a stand on principles? I mean, if there's one message that comes out from Karbala in the most powerful of ways, is the capacity and the ability and the courage to take a stand, and take up a stand in a selfless manner, and in a manner that has a view on the long history. Whether on that battlefield of Karbala, Imam Hussain alayhi salam and its 72 supporters who laid down their lives in the most phenomenal and glorious of ways, whether we think that they were looking very locally at that time at Yazid ibn Muawiyah and on him, that what the forces of Yazid and Yazidiyat are doing. No, their eyes were on humanity and standing for justice against oppression, and challenging the force. That was the most fundamental thing. Whether in this new movement and this effort, are there enough people within the Muslim community who are ready to take up a stand, knowing fully well that that stand, for example, can ruin their careers, can be destructive for their economic well-being, or something else. None of those things matter in the larger context of big ideas. So the capacity and the ability and the courage to take a stand, and take a stand on a principle, I think that's the most that's the thing which is really missing. And if at the end of the day, if the message has to be global, the message of Karbala was not for one community or one time. It was a global message. That's the legacy of Islam. That was exactly when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had said, Husainu minni wa ana minal Husain. He was looking at that long-term global vision, knowing that whatever Imam Hussain was standing for was exactly what the great Prophet of Islam had stood for. And in any major cause, with all the respect, it doesn't seem like the Muslims are really any more inspired by those ideas. Maybe just in rhetoric, maybe talking for 10 days or 20 days or in certain areas, but in terms of internalizing, taking up a stand for humanity and for principles, it seems it's no more ingrained. That is no more the motivating factor that is pushing us. That will only happen when the Muslims join hands for a cause which is so powerful that the humanity says, oh, these are the ideals, and who are the people who are behind these ideals? That's the approach we have to take. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and back to you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Abbas, for being so candid, so incisive in your analysis in terms of the 5 challenges and the 5 strategy points that you've given. I'd like to yield my time to Dr. Aslam with a question. The last point in terms of the inspiration taken from Imam Hussein in terms of having this principal leadership. Do we have any examples in history over the 1400 years that you may be able to share where we might be able to take some inspiration as to what the way forward could be?
Thank you very much, Dr. Abbas, for this wonderful presentation. In fact, while you were talking about the kind of question that was coming to my mind was the one that was raised by Dr. Walji. And I was asking myself, have we seen a principal leadership among Muslims after Imam Hussein in defense of humanity? And the answer is no. Whether it's Shia or it's Sunni, our religious leadership, our institutional leadership tells us we have nothing to do with what is happening with non-Muslims. We are concerned only with Muslims. We are not concerned about American Indians or the Dalits or the victims of apartheid or the victims of persecution in Rwanda and Africa and other places. It's none of our business. And we use the term kuffar for them. And then not only that, we also divide ourselves into Shias and the Sunnis and the Ibadis and the Zawairis and the Barelwis and the Ubandis, that we are not concerned about the dignity of others because they belong to us. So we have not taken a principled stand for centuries. We might say that we care for humanity. We might quote the Quran here and there. We might pretend that we believe in the egalitarian concept of Islam. But when it comes to reality, the very fact that 67% Muslims live below the poverty line, in our world, both Shias and Sunnis, is a basically clear pronouncement on our concept of principled stand. Then comes to the issue of the justice. Show a simple Muslim country, a Muslim institution where justice prevails. Even our families, we lack that kind of understanding. So there is some disorientation in our own selves. We have replaced justice and we have replaced the principled stand with a ritualistic set of what we call the ibadat that basically bring us nothing, not even closeness to God. It's just a pretension that we do, that by chanting a few words in Arabic that we don't even understand. 87% of our population don't even understand what they're chanting. And yet we claim that we are closer to God because of those kind of rituals, without realizing that the essence of justice and principled stand is the essence of the faith, is the essence of the divine guidance, is the essence of that kind of thing. And then secondly, we are still after 1400 years and with after so much historical factual revelations and researchers are debating whether what happened in Karbala was a tussle between the two tribes or a tussle or a struggle for truth and justice. We're still debating that. We still have people who take the sides of oppressors. And we still have the even in our language, when we address all those kind of things, we even lack that basic decency of the Quran that basically prepares us for the struggle of justice and all those kind of things. Occasionally, you would find people here and there in India or in China or Imam Shamil in Soviet Central Union, where they stood up. But one of the points that was praised by Dr. Abbas needs worth noticing. If we are selective in our concept, in our taking sides of justice, then definitely we have no credibility in fighting for justice. And at this particular moment, Muslims do not have that credibility to stand for justice. In order to establish that credibility, we have to take certain baby steps. We have to first identify with humanity as a whole. We have to first speak a language that appeals to the people. We have to use those idioms that are the divinely sanctioned and divinely approved idioms for humanity as a whole, not in sectarian terms, not even cultural and religious terms. And we don't have that idiom at this particular moment. So it is in this particular context, we see what we did in the last 9 days was basically made an effort to say that we also have a human face, even though that human face is very blurred at this time, even though that human face is very wounded and is bleeding, yet we have it. And certainly with the effort on the part of both Shias and Sunnis and all others, if we take a principled stand for the cause of justice, certainly there is no reason that we can attract masses, both Muslims and non-Muslims. And I agree with you that the structure of the state at this moment is not conducive to promote any of the ideas pertaining to justice or pertaining to a principled stand. States would always respond to the economic and financial interests of its power elites. It would never focus on the lives of ordinary people. So it is that mass involvement of people, it is that mass education that basically would require, are we capable of doing that? Not at the moment in the capacities that we have, but 60 years after the Hijrah, the same question was asked by Imam Hussein's followers. Can those 72 people change the course of history? What difference will they make? And the answer came in blood, even though at that particular time, the answer was written in the pages of history forever and would keep on inspiring regardless whether we succeed or whether we fail. So that's what I think about it.
Thank you, Dr. Aslam. I think very profound reflection that you gave us. Dr. Abbas, I have a question for you. You mentioned the 5 points, that there are no shortcuts in global attention. We need to be part of the global narrative, the geopolitical power play. What I'm interested in is number 4 that you mentioned, and that is the recognition at the highest level of academia and think tanks. What is it that can be done? Is there a baby step? For example, that Dr. Aslam mentioned, is there a baby step in terms of changing the narrative? We need to create some thought leadership. And we have discussed this on other platforms, that there is a definite paucity of thought leadership that seems to emerge. And it's the academia and the think tanks, and you're very much part and parcel of that particular sector. So maybe your insight there would be very helpful.
Thank you so much, sir, both to Dr. Aslam. And it's honestly such a delight always to talk to both of you, because we are all on the same page, and we pick on exactly the same points. Dr. Aslam was so brilliant, and I'm grateful for his feedback, and you, Dr. Hassan Walji, as well. Yes, there is absolutely, that should be the first step, and it will be a baby step, because that will build the road. And there the problem is why, for example, picking a case study of United States briefly, there every major university has an Islamic studies program. For example, it is from Princeton University to Harvard University, Stanford. These are the immediate names. Yale, where there are Islamic studies programs, but those programs, to the best of my knowledge, are always struggling for funds. There's no internal Muslim major financial support for building chairs in the names of great people I know. I've been involved in one case, and I think Dr. Walji, you were as well, on the Imam Ali chair that was in Hartford Center. They have changed the name of the institution, I'm forgetting, but that chair is there. But even other chairs on the great Muslim personalities, and on the great thought leaders. And there's no shortage and no dearth of thought leaders, actually. There's just, I'll take this opportunity to mention, a book has come out just this week from Harvard University Press called Text and Interpretation, the legacy of Imam Jafar Sadiq's, Salamullah alayhim. And that book has come from Princeton University professor Hussain Mudarrisi. This is the first book of its kind, for example, which has come from a scholar associated with a major institution, and then by a very important publishing house. The reason was that Harvard Law School and Harvard University has two major centers now on Islamic studies. One was by, I think, the name of a Saudi supporter, Prince Walid, to give him credit where due. I think that's the only persistent funding that has happened in one program by Prince Walid in one of these Harvard institutions. At other places, but what about the Muslim Americans themselves? Are they generally invested in academia and on the policy side? No. And that's what the approach will be. The Muslim response so far has been to build their own small think tanks. And I wish I can write on this at some point. There are at least 6 or 7 attempts made, I think, well thought out, well inspired, well-directed efforts, whether they built local Muslim think tanks. And almost all of those failed, except one major one, which is, I think, Triple IT effort that is still actually happening in the Virginia area. They have an excellent publishing house, and they have organized many things. They have now a new think tank. They have purchased a university as well, actually, in Virginia area. That's one important effort that I know. But and they are my friends, but with due respect to them, whether the Triple IT publications and some of the narrative is being pushed by or collaborated with other scholars in mainstream academia, the response is very mixed, not much. I would not like to take credit away from them for so much of hard work and financial investment, but still, there has to be tens of such institutions which should do it. I know of a major think tank in Washington, D.C. area, which briefly I was involved with as well. They started a program called Muslim Diaspora, and it fizzled out because of lack of funding. Every major think tank, and being in D.C., that's my job. I interact with them. I go to, because of my area of expertise, security studies, which I interact with, and that's an area where there's a lot of interest. So I contribute and write papers and contribute in panels for many think tanks. I often ask this question because there's the element of the Muslim response or the Muslim contribution is often missing. And I'm always told that most of these reports and many of these positions are funded by different groups. And they, despite effort by some very well-meaning think tankers or scholars, they were not able to get enough funding on these issues. So yes, that will be not to try to build another small think tank, but to engage with the institutions which are already there, which have built their credibility, programs there, or making contributions there, or inspiring the scholars, the Muslim scholars, investing in Muslim scholars. How many people from the Muslim community actually go for their PhDs in public policy or in cybersecurity or in areas on environmental studies. Now there are scholars coming up. I mean, if I have to project, I would say next 5 to 7 years, you will see some leading Muslim scholars. Things I would not like to give a dark picture. I think in the last many years, whether in government policy or government institutions, new Muslim scholars are coming up. A new generation is being trained, but it will take another 5 to 7 to 10 years to get into the positions of influence or where they can contribute. That should be an area where we should dedicate our attention to, because that will prepare a Muslim thought leadership, and it will enable the Muslim voices to be projected through the institutions which are already established there, rather than trying to create our own. Start engaging with the ones which are already there, and they may have strange requests. They may have, they pick up topics which are not to your liking, but the engagement part is extremely important.
So I think, thank you for that elucidation. Here is, I'm playing the devil's advocate here. Yes, I mean, you mentioned the book that just been published from Princeton, and we're very glad to actually have that book, etc. My question is that in terms of the specific topic that we've chosen of social justice and working for the oppressed people, what steps can we take to get some of these to truly get engaged, that they would pick up, say like the case of the Uyghurs, and we start building something on it? Are there institutions or are there possibilities where we do something practical that rather than, I mean, yes, the purely academic theology is important, but this sector is, I believe, of tremendous importance. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think extremely important point. You're so right. Two publications come to my mind. There's a Muslim scholar, Azim Ibrahim, who has been really pushing for more focus on the Rohingya crisis, for example. And he published some reports which ultimately got into US Congress and other areas. His work also on Uyghurs, and this is actually a publication called New Lines by IIIT, the organization that I was mentioning, that has started having an impact. There's some other areas as well, because one bias that the mainstream system has, and I must admit I'm in that group which works on those issues, on security issues and extremism and terrorism issues, because of the post 9/11 scenario, and there was a huge focus on that. And by the time the Muslim scholars have come up with producing some outstanding scholars who can contribute in that areas, the focus has now shifted away from counterterrorism and other issues. And the reason is because we are not investing in empowering scholars who are working on social justice or environmental ideas, for example. And on environmental issues, that's a scope, this is an area that's amazing. I had read a book some time ago called Green Dean, which was published by this Muslim scholar in New York. And that was an environment. And when many people read it, that this is what Islam's point of view is on this idea of environment, that was a very powerful way. There was nothing religious about it in terms of jurisprudence, or it never sounded like a religious interest, but it was a phenomenal idea about humanity. A better world, a better earth for everyone will help. That again requires investment. Whether some of the scholars who have to publish the reports or articles and books, is there any single Muslim foundation that helps research? In fact, I'll add that one thing which I should have added because I'm a strong advocate of it. If I, for example, I'm working on any ideas, I'll immediately, and I'm a scholar, I want research, write a policy paper or write a book, I will first think of MacArthur Foundation. For instance, if I'm working on the nuclear issues, I look at Ford Foundation, I look at Smith Richardson Foundation. I am a recipient of a couple of book grants from them. Amazing institution. You pitch an idea to them, and if the idea is good, you get maybe $50,000 for a report. If your idea is very good and you're bringing something new, you may get $200,000, $300,000. I know scholars who received. I was a recipient of very small grants, but what I'm mentioning is there an institution, a Muslim-owned philanthropist, who are ready to fund research, irrespective of looking at what immediately interests us in a somewhat selfish manner. Selfish, I'm using the word how the others will look at it. Are we even have not enough grants to give to people who Muslim scholars? If there's a good idea, the Muslim philanthropists should be the biggest supporters of an idea which we think is an idea that would support the idea of justice. So a foundation which is only looking at grant making for research and policy, and they have a board, they look at just the merit of an idea, irrespective of who's asking for it. And those reports and publications that you will fund ultimately will have a huge impact. So that's another area. And I emphasize this because I think there's no shortage of Muslims who have the financial capability to support it. So a foundation maybe, which will have no agenda of its own. The foundation will not publish anything by themselves, not at all. But they'll have enough money, maybe to start with $1 billion, which may sound big, but it's actually very small when it comes to the research side of things. They have 10 people, scholars from Hassan Walji and Aleem Saab to Dr. Aslam, and I really mean it. And you have a board of 10 people, you are just looking at, you are advertising, we are going to support this issue, or Rohingya, for example. Any scholars, irrespective of who the scholar is, from what ethnic, religious, sectarian background they come from, you look at the merit and you'll provide fund and research to that. You're indirectly empowering people. That's the way to pick up ideas on social justice. Build a foundation. It should not be difficult. If in any given state, I look at the number of new mosques and new centers that are being built, it will take the cost of maybe 2 centers. Or maybe actually 1 center. I know of a center where I am, which they are building, which is a great idea, $10 million. If there are already 10 or 20 Islamic centers in this area, I would rather invest the next $10 million into a foundation to support researchers and empower young scholars on topics that are close to your and my heart, rather than building a center.
Thank you, Dr. Abbas. In the interest of time, I will request Dr. Aslam to respond and at the same time have concluding remarks, because this is the last in the series, and also perhaps give a pointer as to what we plan to do in the future. And then we'll ask Dr. Abbas to conclude with the dua. So the floor is yours, Dr. Aslam. You are muted.
Simultaneous to what Dr. Abbas and you have been advocating, is important to connect with the masses. Masses have been in the grip of a religious leadership that does not understand the nature of the divine guidance in changing times and eternally. It has totally neglected the ideas of justice and the ideas of equality and ideas of human dignity. And you would not find these 3 principles anywhere in any part of the Muslim world being practiced at the grassroots level or at the highest level. People may say that they float. So I think we need to connect with the masses with these essential aspects of faith and prepare our minds that Islam is for humanity, and without taking care of humanity, Islam is meaningless to Muslims. It has to be as straightforward as it is, because without that, our claim of a universal eternal message is meaningless. So that's one of the most important things. And in that respect, it cannot be done by Shias alone. It cannot be done by Sunnis alone. In fact, this kind of terminology that we use has to basically be the things of the past. We have to move in the direction of the advocates and the voice of justice, voice of reason, voice of dignity, and voice of truth. As Imam Hussain being the leader of that, caravan. So we have to basically move in that particular direction. And I think if we work harder, both these two communities, Imam Hussain can definitely be restored to that position that he's destined to be a leader of humanity in the real sense of the term. And for that, we'll have to change our own attitude and our own things. So one of the things that we can do is that throughout this year, we can focus on more such communities who have been oppressed throughout history. And then we involve more scholars from these two communities and more leaders from these two communities to come up with a language and with an idiom that basically talks of the unity in purpose and unity in defense of humanity, in defense of dignity, and in defense of justice, and then move forward there rather than pointing fingers at each other as to the theology of each other or as to the historical stand of each other, but rather move forward in a positive manner to bring about changes not only for ourselves but for others as well. So I think it is possible, but it all depends on those who basically commit themselves at the initial stage to this movement. As rightly pointed out by Dr. Abbas, what is our capacity to basically be part of this movement? If we have a higher capacity, certainly the higher results can be achieved. If we have a lower capacity, then certainly it would be like any other movement in history where ideas emerge and then are buried in the dustbin of history. I think I'll stop here and give it back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Aslam. I really wanted you to wind up the series towards the end, if you do me the honors.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, that it's both of us are the co-hosts, so you would also wind it up. I think, Dr. Abbas, you summarized the essence of the series by pointing out 5 realities and 5 possibilities. And certainly we have taken note of them very seriously, and we hope that would be the focus of discussion in the coming months and coming segments that would focus on other things. But what is important is that the series and the discussions that we have encouraged us to pursue the path and then try once again to see if we are capable of doing something on the lines of what we have been talking about in terms of the sacrifice of Imam Hussain and in terms of the struggles of the Ahl Bayt in restoring the truth and in restoring the justice for humanity as a whole. And we hope that with the involvement of many others, this series might lead us to something useful, something beneficial for us. And I believe that the United States is perhaps the right place for this kind of emergence of the movement, because it is perhaps the only country which would allow us the freedom to experiment with our ideas fearlessly and openly and candidly. And hopefully many of us who understand the nature of this country and who understand the nature of the struggle would grasp the opportunity and work on it to see if the dreams of the past can be relived again.
Thank you. I just wanted to also make one remark as we conclude and pass this back to Dr. Abbas for a dua. We have tried to cover 10 communities in this series. That does not mean that we will not be covering other oppressed communities in the days to come, but the limitations of the sessions and the time meant that we had to cover about 10 communities that we've covered so far. So inshallah, going forward, we will have some programs where we also look at the other oppressed minorities. With that said, I'd like to thank Brother Aleem of IslamiCity for facilitating this and also giving us the inspiration to come up with these themes, and the IT team, Brother Aji and others behind the scenes to make this work so seamlessly. We thank them. I thank my co-host, Dr. Aslam Abdallah, is a mentor to me, and I always love working with him, and I learn a lot. And thank you, Dr. Hassan Abbas, once again, joining us, and we truly benefited, from your very incisive, I would say, in a very structured conversation in terms
Dr.
of...
Faldi, you use the wrong word. It's not mentor, it is mentor.
No, it is mentor. The dry humor that we have between us once we are off the air is something amazing, but we don't give those bloopers away. Dr. Abbas, thank you, and the structured way that you've been able to, give us, as Dr. Aslam said, we made a note of that. We've taken notes on that, and inshallah, we'll be reaching out to you to help us expand on some of the key points that have been raised in this session. So now over to you for a dua.
Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Thank you so much. I'm so honored. And the only prayer that comes to my mind is in reference to the way the God Almighty introduced the greatest of all human beings, Hazrat Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to us by saying, "Wama arsalnaka illa rahmatul lil alamin." So our beloved Prophet was sent as a blessing for the whole universe. And people ask, so what universe? And we say, only we know of that universe when we read the first chapter or the first part of Quran, when we say Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wherever the God is the Rabb of the Alameen, it's Wama arsalnaka illa rahmatul lil alamin. The same Alameen, wherever these are, our Prophet is the blessing. The only way we can live up as a followers of our beloved Prophet in this world is because he was the blessing for the universe. The Muslim community following him should be blessing for the humanity. If we are not a blessing for the humanity, we cannot be true to our Prophet. That's my prayer, that God allows us, enables us, empowers us, the Muslim community in this world, to be a blessing for the world and for the humanity here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. To our viewers, inshallah, we will be back with more programs. At the moment, I say, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.